Good afternoon. I'm Martin Mühleisen. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and I'm here live at the IMF headquarters for the IMF World Bank Spring Meetings. To my left are Bayoumi and Ravi Balakrishnan, and the three of us will be talking about Europe and Europe's many policy challenges. Just by way of introduction, Ravi Balakrishnan is the chief European economist for JP Morgan. He's had a long career at the IMF. Among others, he's been a resident in Singapore, and he's also been heading the work of the IMF's European team. Bayoumi has been working on the World Economic Outlook, and he's been in the Strategy Policy Department of the IMF for a long time. I should say that, for full disclosure, the three of us have been working together a long time ago at the IMF on the US and Canada desk. So, with that having said, I'm handing over to Tam for questions on the UK, and then we'll shift back the focus on the European Union. Tam.
Well, thank you. As you can guess from the accents, I'm asking about the UK and Martin's asking about Europe. Just very briefly, as a way of starting, you know, there was a time 20 years ago when everybody thought the UK was the sick man of Europe and Europe was the sick man of the US, if you like, and we seem to be sort of back with those worries again. So starting with the UK, how do you read the fiscal situation currently? And the reason I ask this is you sort of get two stories, one of which is austerity went too far and therefore we need to spend more, and another is that, you know, as we know with the short Liz Truss premiership, you know, there was financial market disturbance about her plans, which suggests that they're spending too much. So where are we?
Well, it's great to be here with you, Martin and Tam. You know, I'm really happy that we could do this session. I think we've got to put the UK in context. The UK has major challenges, but it's not the only one on the fiscal side. The US has major challenges. There's lots of discussion about the debt sustainability position of the United States. We all know in Europe there's many high debt countries, there's new fiscal rules there. So I think they've all got similar challenges. They've got challenges of population aging, they've got challenges of trying to bring debt down in the context of weaker growth. And some of those challenges are magnified in the United Kingdom. You mentioned austerity, that's affected various things like the NHS, it's affected the physical infrastructure. You've also got to pay for the digital and green transitions. And having a weak growth outlook really doesn't help that, because ultimately the easiest way to solve your debt problems is growth. And for us, the UK's growth, medium-term growth has taken a hit. It goes back to the global financial crisis, since when labour productivity has been very weak. Brexit has added to those woes. So we think that potential growth in the United Kingdom is below 1%. So that really makes it hard to address these challenges. So there's going to be very hard spending and taxation choices that have to be made. The Tory government's obviously started with that in its most recent budget. We'll see what happens in the election, likely to be later this year. Now, turning to the point you mentioned about the mini-budget crisis, to me that was very instructive, and I think it's helped a lot of people because it's done two things. It's emphasized the importance of fiscal councils like the Office of Budget and Responsibility. It's also emphasized the point about you cannot have unfunded tax cuts and just have an expectation of growth. So there's a very severe reaction to that, and the way I see it was a classic foreign exchange risk premium shock. You had the 10-year sovereign rate spiking by 100 basis points in a very short period of time, yet at the same time, sterling tanked. That is a classic risk premium shock, which is gradually unwound as the UK government has brought more stability and credibility to fiscal policy making since then, but the challenges still remain.
And how big do you see those challenges? I mean, you said it's going to be difficult and difficult decisions are going to have to be made, but you know, are we talking about retrenchment of the budget deficit, or where are we?
Well, currently they have a fiscal rule which the idea is to bring debt down over a 5-year period. So 5 years out, debt should be declining relative to where it was at the time of the forecast being made, or the budget. Now, that gives you some scope, because you can have debt increasing in the interim years, so you can have some investment, but obviously a 5-year horizon is not that long. So it does put some constraints, and if growth is weak, then it makes it harder. Now, one difference that we have is that the OBR has, we would say, pretty optimistic growth forecasts. I mean, its medium-term growth forecast is 1.6. Its interim growth forecasts, or before you get to the steady state, the growth forecasts are even stronger than that as you come back to trend from above. So that means that you've created some fiscal headroom, which the government's used to take various measures. But if you use our numbers, the fiscal headroom would be less. And also, there's already a fair amount of consolidation built in to the forecasts. So you'll see that actually there's a structural adjustment which is quite significant over the next few years, which is already taking place. And I think future governments will likely follow that, given the idea is to bring debt down. So the challenge of getting investment up and getting debt down over 5 years is not straightforward.
So turning for a second to monetary policy, again, there was higher inflation in the UK than in many other countries. Why was that, and how has the Bank of England dealt with it?
Yeah, I mean, the UK did have higher inflation than in other advanced economies. We often look at the United States, obviously the euro area. I think there's various reasons for that. The most important one is more entrenched supply side problems than elsewhere. The terms of trade shock is similar for the euro area and the United Kingdom. They both had a significantly negative terms of trade shock. The US had a positive terms of trade shock. That made a big difference to energy prices and overall headline inflation. But if you look at focus on core, we do see over the last year or so, there's been a stronger rhythm to services and wage inflation in the United Kingdom. That's starting to come off a little bit. Momentum is turning, but still the year-on-year rates of services inflation and wage inflation are higher, and that reflects simply the fact that you've had more entrenched supply-side issues. Brexit is certainly a big part of that. I mean, the OBR estimates the impact on work-related labor supply, trade and investment will take around 4% off GDP, so that's a large number. Now, turning to the Bank of England and how it's done, I think all central banks faced, we use the word unprecedented too many times, but there were certainly, the pandemic was a unique shock. Obviously, there hasn't been a major one since the Spanish flu. Then you had the war in Ukraine, so these are major shocks which are not in your normal realm of central bank policy making. So it's not surprising that there were, the forecast didn't perform particularly well. But this is not unique to the Bank of England. It happened at the Fed, it happened at the ECB. I think the Bernanke report on the Bank of England's forecasting and communications performance made that point clear, that really the Bank of England wasn't an outlier in terms of not forecasting the inflation up and down badly. It was true of other forecasters looking at the UK and also the ECB and the Fed.
Now, you've mentioned a lot, low growth, constraints, supply constraints. One of the themes that one sees, particularly if you read people like Martin Wolf in the FT, is that the UK does have a structural problem with growth, and there seems to be a lot of conversation about what to do about that. I guess two questions. The first is, what does need to be done about it? Because we see lots of different ideas. And the second is, how closely to that do the agendas of the two parties look?
I think it's a big issue. As I was saying, low growth is a problem in many major zones. It's not just for the United Kingdom, it's also for the euro area. The US obviously has got a little bit better performance. There's a whole debate about secular stagnation since the early part of the start of this century. What I would say is that a lot of solutions, we can come up with easy to identify solutions, but they're hard to implement in practice. I'll give you an example, is planning regulation for housing supply in the UK. I mean, many people have talked about it, wanted to do things about it, but it's just been very hard politically. Taking the constraint of Brexit as given in the near term, the focus clearly has to be on two elements, labor productivity and labor input growth. Labor productivity has been very weak since the GFC. Further investments in digitalization, the green transition, physical infrastructure, and AI are needed, but given the lack of fiscal space that we talked about, a lot of this has to come from the private sector. The UK does have certain good facets which are important. It has low cost of doing business, liberal labor and product markets. It's got world-class universities, so all these things should help. And I certainly think maintaining certainty of regulatory and tax regimes will be important going forward for investors to think about longer-term projects.
And just briefly, before we move on to the euro area,
Sorry, you asked me a question about the platforms of the two parties,
Yes.
yeah? Sorry, I didn't answer that. It looks actually they're not that different. And the reason is quite simple. It's because there's a lack of fiscal space. And if the Labour government does win the election, they're likely to want to establish economic credibility with markets and with other stakeholders. So they will want to run a very tight fiscal ship initially, I think. So I don't think initially there will not be many differences between what we've seen so far, and if a Labour government does come in, what they'll end up doing, that could change over time.
Well, on that, I think we should turn over to the euro area.
Yeah, the lack of fiscal space is something that I want to come back to also, Ravi. But first of all, maybe looking at monetary policy and the diverging economic performance of the EU or the euro area and the US. I mean, the US is booming ahead. Fed may keep rates longer, high for longer. The ECB may cut. Is that the right kind of way to think about it? Do you think that's appropriate?
I think, I mean, we get lots of questions about can the ECB move first?
Yeah.
There's no reason why the ECB can't move first.
Right.
I mean, it's a large central bank, and obviously there's some spillovers from what happens in the United States. If you do see significant interest rate divergence, that'll lead to impact on the exchange rate, the euro likely depreciate, that has an impact on inflation. The ECB will take that into account. There could be a read-through from what's happening with US inflation dynamics, given the fact that a lot of the increase in inflation was global. A lot of it was on the good side. I think on the services side there's more idiosyncrasies and differences across the different zones, but ultimately there is some important information for what happens in other zones. But ultimately the ECB will make decisions based on its own mandate, which is its price stability mandate in the euro area. So our current forecasts are for the ECB to start cutting in June, and for the Fed to start cutting in July. It does look like the growth data is certainly more robust in the United States than in the euro area. But we do expect them to converge a little bit over the course of 2024. We expect that US growth will decelerate from significantly above trend growth rates that we've seen over the last few quarters. And the euro will gradually pick up from stagnation that it suffered in late last year to close to trend growth by the end of the year. So they'll gradually converge. I guess the big thing which the ECB will focus on is really two things that we talked about a little bit earlier in the UK context. Services inflation, wages inflation. Those are going to be the two key aspects they'll look for in the next few months before the June meeting, which will also be a forecast round for them, so they'll have a new forecast to make decisions with.
Right. Now, fiscal policy in the EU. Maybe you want to kind of tell us a little bit about what you think about the new agreement, the fiscal rules that were revamped in Europe. But at the same time now that they have a new set of rules, there's a lot of fiscal pressures coming down the pike, right? There's still the kind of green investment package that's being implemented. There's aging pressures. We're talking about a big push to finance climate-related spending, both in Europe, but also through development aid and the like abroad. And then you have this whole military problem of quickly mobilizing help for Ukraine, but also strengthening the indigenous defense industry, so to speak. So both at the EU level and for the national governments, it seems that there's a lot of fiscal pressure really in the pike, but they're facing these rules. Is that all compatible, or does something have to give? What do you think?
It's not easy. The challenges, as I mentioned, is broadly everywhere, regardless of what fiscal rules you have. I would say that the new fiscal rules which should enter into force this summer, obviously the European Parliament has got a plenary session, I think next week, where they should rubber stamp the rules and then it will be approved by the Council. The good things about it is a focus on debt sustainability analysis. I think anchoring on medium-term net spending paths is a very good thing. We have seen evidence that doing that does reduce the tendency to have budget slippages over time, and it leads to more consistency in fiscal policy making. So we think those things are good. I think the debt and deficit safeguards, which are imposed later on in the process of negotiations, make it more complex and do make it harder. I think there's really quite limited room for public investment if you want to bring debt down sustainably over 10 years, and also if you want to respect the debt and deficit safeguards. I mean, it leaves you limited room for maneuver. So I think that's going to be difficult, because if you look at the estimates of additional investments, they're very large. And this is before talking about artificial intelligence, so thinking about digitalization or even the green transition. I've seen estimates of additional public investment of between 0.5 to 1% of GDP, and the numbers could be larger if you include the other elements. So these are big ticket numbers, and you add to that defense pressures. So it's going to be hard to make it all square. I think there's going to have to be some really hard decisions, particularly on the spending side, on the current spending side, if you want to create space for public investment, and on the tax side as well. Although tax levels are high in Europe, there's obviously certain areas you can think about the composition of taxation and look very carefully where you can potentially increase it while not suffering from efficiency losses. But overall, it's going to be hard. I do think that means the focus has to be on catalyzing private investment for many of these areas.
Yeah. Well, speaking about private investment, actually, which is a very good point, I believe, but Europe has a bit of a problem in the sense that it still has a lot of compartmentalized capital markets, rules. So supervision is being unified, but still it's a big national element. So the European banking and capital market is one of the big projects that's still outstanding. There has been a new ESM treaty which hasn't been ratified. And in general, regulations in Europe seem to be still an issue. I mean, people talking about German red tape, for example, all the time. So makes all that, does this make all that make you optimistic that there will actually be a lot of capital inflows, a lot of private investment, or do the Europeans need to do their homework, but fast? What's giving?
I think it's clear that, and leaders are aware of this, because ongoing discussions, there's a EU leaders summit taking place right now where this is a big focus, the Capital Markets Union. They're really trying to push ahead because they realize that to catalyze the private investment they need, they're going to need further Capital Markets Unions to get private risk sharing across borders in Europe. So I think that's important. But I would say that I don't think you can focus alone on Capital Markets Union. You have to also put Banking Union into the mix. The euro economy is very bank-based, so ultimately you cannot make significant progress on Capital Markets Union without further progress on Banking Union. So the two go hand in hand, and Banking Union has been stalled. So I think we have to also work on that leg as well. But I think it's good that leaders are focusing on it. Hopefully you can get further progress in areas of bankruptcy law harmonization, withholding taxes harmonization. There's various areas of CMU which need to be worked on in the next European Parliament. So I think having the political impetus will certainly help, but there are still lots of vested interests who will push back. I mean, you've got the difference between the bigger nations and some of the smaller nations, and those will still be there. So how to navigate that is going to be really important to watch in the coming months and years, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, that's a bit of kind of a question that springs up when you talk about private investment. London always used to be a financial place that intermediated a lot of capital flows into Europe and out of Europe. But with Brexit, of course, it's changing now. And what do you think? Where are the places where capital will be kind of intermediated in Europe? Is it still through London despite all the rupture, or are there new places in Europe emerging where it will happen, for example, Frankfurt?
I think this will evolve over time. I mean, it's a big loss to the EU because London was the center for capital markets, and that's sort of been lost in a way. But I think EU policymakers will also be fairly realistic about it. And I give you an example of where we've seen that is when it comes to euro derivatives and how to clear them. The biggest clearinghouse is in the United Kingdom, in London. And the recent agreement in February of this year was that there had to be some clearing of euro derivatives onshore, i.e. in EU clearinghouses, but still a lot of it could take place through London. So I do think that EU policymakers will be pragmatic about this if they want to develop the capital markets union, even if it does mean that some of the activity will still remain in London. But we have to see politically, this is still very much in play, and rules can change over time. So, but there has been already migration of certain activity to the continent. We see this in JP Morgan. Like JP Morgan's presence in Paris and Frankfurt has increased since Brexit.
Oh, interesting. Well, that leaves maybe one difficult topic still to discuss as far as Europe is concerned, which is that Europe is a continent that lives from trade, investment, the big open economies and small open economies, very successful, but their two biggest counterparts are China and the US. And There's a bit of tit for tat ongoing between China and the US, of course, but even US-European trade relations are a bit strained for various reasons, obviously, the IRA being one. How do you see Europe dealing with these pressures? Is there a strong enough common response to both of these counterparties? Are there some changes ongoing in the economic structure that they look for other markets, or how do you think they should respond to these challenges from a decline and slowdown in globalization?
I think it's very hard. You've got two big elephants in the room, US and China. Euro is also, EU is also a big power, but the difference is it's a single market and it's not a federation of states compared to the United States. So the scope for action at the EU level is less, and you have very clear state aid rules which complicate the giving of state aid at the national level. Now there's been some relaxation of that temporarily, given the pandemic and given the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis, but longer term they need to think about state aid and about EU level support holistically. The letter report, which came out yesterday on the single market, did mention some things along these lines, have suggested maybe a stricter enforcement of state aid at the national level, combined with a progressive expansion of EU level funding at the same time. So you have the stick and the carrot in a way. It's hard to argue the logic of that, but in practice it may be hard to implement. We saw this, for example, in when it came to the relaxation of state aid for the Green Industrial Plan. Many smaller nations or member states were calling for further EU level funding. That wasn't delivered, the relaxation was. So it's about pairing the two together, which will be important. And I think we made the case when I was previously at the IMF, when we were thinking about the fiscal rules, to get the investment. One thing would be to have an EU fiscal capacity which focused on a climate fund, but that climate fund would effectively deal with projects which cross borders. So for example, the spillovers from pollution in one country to another. You may have grid interconnectivity, which needs to increase significantly to facilitate an increase in supply of renewables, which will be stable. So these things cross borders, so you can make the case for a fund which does that and takes account of the externality which some of these problems do create. So the logic makes sense. Will we get agreement? We'll have to see. It depends on the political impetus for it, and a lot of these things will require unanimity, which is not easy.
Right. Ravi, thanks a lot. Tam, thank you very much. That's it for the problems of Europe. We have more to come, so stay tuned, and we have another day of programming of the Atlantic Council's take on the spring meetings tomorrow. Thank you very much for watching.